For decades, a deeply distorted idea has circulated about Nazi Germany, that those who didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes were automatically condemned by the regime. Many of us grew up hearing phrases like, "Hitler only wanted blondes," repeated in school books or tossed around in casual remarks, as if hair color alone determined life or death. Even jokingly, some would say, "Hitler would have loved you," to someone with light eyes, without understanding the real meaning behind such a statement. This extreme oversimplification is not only false, but it also hides the complex mechanisms of exclusion and violence that truly drove the Nazi regime. The notion of a physically perfect archetype was more a tool of propaganda than a strict biological standard. What truly mattered to Nazism was lineage and racial heritage, not outward appearance. In this analysis, we will dismantle the myth of the mandatory blonde in Nazi ideology, revealing that many of Hitler's closest allies did not fit that model at all. We will explore what being considered Aryan actually meant in Nazi Germany, how those ideas were enforced in practice, and why the myth of blonde hair and blue eyes still endures in popular memory today. The Aryan myth, unmasking the Nazi obsession with blood over looks. During the Nazi regime, the concept of the Aryan was not strictly based on physical traits such as hair or eye color. Although the propaganda ideal, blonde, blue-eyed, tall and slim, was promoted symbolically in practice, Nazism defined Aryan identity by genealogical lineage, not appearance. Regime officials measured skull proportions, nose and ear shapes, but they did not classify people by eye or hair color. This was a practical decision. Most Germans are neither blonde nor blue-eyed, and promoting such rare traits as a standard would have been absurd. In fact, Hitler admired figures like Otto Skorzeny and Leon Degrelle, both dark-haired and neither of them German. Even in Germany, people with blonde hair and blue eyes were a minority, and part of the Allied propaganda campaign exaggerated and mocked this Aryan ideal to ridicule the regime. A famous French cartoon captured it perfectly. The ideal Aryan must be as blonde as Hitler, as slim as Goering, and as tall as Goebbels. Himmler was the one most obsessed with such traits, especially when selecting members for the SS, but even there, exceptions were common. In reality, Nazi racial decisions were more ideological than scientific, focused more on eliminating the non-German, Jews, Slavs, communists, than on finding blue-eyed blondes. As in many totalitarian regimes, simplistic and inaccurate ideas embedded themselves in the public's mind, and the myth of the blue-eyed blonde became widespread even though it did not truly reflect the Nazi racial policy. The Nazi idea of the Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, was not only incorrect, but built on a chain of false assumptions. One of the most fundamental errors was the belief that Northern Europeans, because they spoke Germanic languages, were directly connected to the ancient Indo-European peoples who introduced those languages to Europe. However, modern linguistics has shown that Germanic languages such as German, Swedish, or English did not originate in the north, but arrived there only around 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, coming from Central and Eastern Europe. Before that, the people of the north spoke entirely different, now extinct languages, and were not Germanic in any ethnic or linguistic sense. Moreover, the typical image of the ideal Aryan, tall, fair-skinned, blonde and blue-eyed, has no direct connection to the peoples who brought Indo-European languages to Europe. In fact, the genes responsible for those physical traits already existed in ancient Europeans thousands of years before the arrival of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. For example, individuals living in Motala, Sweden, over 7,000 years ago carried the genes for light skin and blue eyes. These traits did not come with the so-called Aryans, nor do they reflect any kind of racial or cultural superiority. They are the result of much earlier genetic mixing, long before the spread of Indo-European languages. The Nazi obsession with linking language, race and physical appearance into a single ideal was the product of a deeply flawed interpretation of history, genetics and linguistics. The term Aryan, originally used in Indo-Iranian languages, was twisted to justify a narrative of Nordic supremacy that collapses under academic scrutiny. Ironically, many of the peoples the Nazis looked down on, such as Iranians or some Caucasian groups, were far more closely connected to the true historical and linguistic meaning of Aryan. What the Nazis presented as a symbol of purity was in fact an artificial construct based on myths, not science. The Aryan paradox: why Hitler idolized traits he didn't possess. The reason Hitler promoted the image of the ideal Aryan, blonde hair, blue eyes, and physical strength, despite not possessing these traits himself, lies in the racial ideology that Nazism turned into dogma. For the Nazis, being Aryan was not about physical appearance alone, but about ethnic lineage and blood purity. Hitler, though dark-haired, was considered Aryan because his ancestry was Germanic, and there were no known traces of Jewish heritage. What truly mattered was belonging to a pure Nordic race, untainted by groups the regime deemed inferior. Hitler believed the Nordic Aryan race was biologically and spiritually superior to all others. According to this distorted worldview, Aryans were naturally brave, intelligent, disciplined, and aesthetically superior. The ideal of blonde hair and light eyes was not imposed for superficial beauty, but as a symbol of ancient purity that, according to Himmler and other Nazi ideologues, needed to be restored and expanded. This obsession led to the creation of the Lebensborn program in 1935, which aimed to breed racially pure children through the union of SS officers and women who fit the racial standard. The Lebensborn project was one of the most extreme expressions of the Nazi attempt at racial re-engineering, offering incentives to suitable mothers and granting special privileges to their children. However, despite the propaganda, the program only produced around 12,000 children, many of whom suffered from marginalization, psychological trauma, and abandonment after the war. While Hitler promoted a physical ideal he did not embody, his true aim was to exert ideological and biological control over the population, driven by a delusional vision of racial purity. Was Hitler Aryan? The answer is yes, at least according to the definition used by the Nazis themselves. His eyes were blue. This is a confirmed fact. And although he didn't have blonde hair, that didn't exclude him from the category. In the racial theories of the time, Aryans were not defined solely by physical appearance. Hitler considered himself Aryan because he was a native German speaker and could prove he had no Jewish ancestry. Moreover, within the Nazi racial framework, the Nordic ideal of blonde hair and light eyes was only one branch of the so-called Aryan race. Alpine, Dinaric, Mediterranean, East Baltic, and even Iranid peoples were also considered Aryan. And what about the rumors of a Jewish grandfather? The so-called Frankenberger theory, which claimed his grandmother had worked for a Jewish family and had an illegitimate child, has been widely discredited by historians. There's no conclusive evidence linking Hitler to Jewish ancestry. His father, Alois, was born illegitimately, but was later registered with the surname Hitler. Under Nazi racial laws, what truly mattered was proving a clean bloodline, and Hitler was able to do that, at least on paper. In Mein Kampf, Hitler even praised the ancient Greeks and Romans as the highest expressions of Aryan greatness, further showing that his concept of Aryan identity went far beyond simple physical stereotypes. In fact, the Nazi regime was full of contradictions. Many of its top leaders, including Hitler, did not fit the physical ideal they themselves promoted. What truly mattered wasn't outward appearance, but lineage and ideological usefulness. So, even though Hitler wasn't the blonde, blue-eyed Nordic archetype he glorified within his own racial logic, he was considered Aryan. And that was enough for him to lead a regime that defined identity and fate for millions based on a deeply distorted concept of race and purity. The construction of the Aryan race myth: origins, lies, and obsession. Shortly after rising to power in 1933, Adolf Hitler created the world's first Ministry of Propaganda. He knew that if he wanted to succeed in his plans of creating a new humanity according to the principles of the Nazi Party, he first needed to gain the common people's soul for his cause. Officially known as the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, its first and only minister was Joseph Goebbels, a cunning and bright close ally of Hitler's. Goebbels, who came from a modest family that lived in an industrial town in West Germany, was fairly educated. He completed his university entrance examination in 1917, and throughout his studies he was the top student of his class. His parents initially hoped that he would become a Catholic priest, but Goebbels went on to study literature, aided by a scholarship from the Albertus Magnus Society. At the University of Heidelberg, Goebbels wrote his doctoral thesis on Wilhelm von Schütz, a minor 19th-century romantic dramatist. After submitting the thesis and passing his oral examination, Goebbels received his PhD on 21st April 1922 at the age of 24. By 1940, he had written 14 books. A member of the Nazi Party since 1924, he quickly climbed through the ranks of the newly created organization thanks to his intelligence and his practical ideas. He was the main instigator of the creation of the Ministry of Propaganda, but this initiative was not born out of his genius. The emphasis the Nazis placed on organization arose from their analysis of the reasons behind the success of the Bolsheviks. In 1928, Goebbels declared that despite racist nationalists having better ideas, the Marxists triumphed in the Russian Revolution simply because they were better organized. Organization was key to the effectiveness of propaganda, and he wanted to replicate that principle in Germany. A society that was fully committed to the ideas of Nazism would no doubt work harder to have them implemented. He wanted to achieve this by convincing the so-called pure Germans that they were better than the rest of the world. In its simplest form, Nazi early propaganda had two main objectives. First, convince the Germans that they were destined for glory on account of their better genetics. And secondly, to paint Jews, blacks, Slavs, Gypsies and other ethnicities as inferior. One of the main areas in which this inferiority was made evident was in the outside appearance of the individuals. Jews were portrayed in Third Reich press as sinister characters, grotesque caricatures that really had no resemblance to real German Jews that lived in the country at that time. In contrast, the ideal German body was lean, muscular, white, with blonde hair and deep blue eyes. Again, this portrayal did not represent most of the so-called real Germans that comprised most of the population of the country. Even Goebbels himself was far removed from the Nazi ideal of a real Aryan man with superior biology. During childhood, Goebbels experienced ill health, which included a long bout of inflammation of the lungs. He had a deformed right foot, which turned inwards due to a congenital disorder. It was thicker and shorter than his left foot. Just prior to starting grammar school, he underwent an operation which failed to correct the problem. Goebbels wore a metal brace and a special shoe because of his shortened leg and walked with a limp. He was rejected for military service in World War I because of this deformity. An overwhelming majority of Nazi officials and hierarchs had dark hair and eyes, but still they chose to create and support the myth of a superior civilization made of blonde men and women with blue eyes and a privileged biology that prevented them from getting many diseases that were common in so-called subhuman populations. But where did this historical myth begin? Its origins are more obscure and profound than one would think and stretch into the realms of pseudoscience and occultism, two of the main beliefs of most early Nazis. A deeply ingrained sense of symbolism and the search for a glorious past in the primitive Germanic tribes and even the Nordic warriors that conquered Britain and Iceland were among the main preoccupations of the ideologues of National Socialism in its formative years. From 1933 onwards, with the invaluable help of the Ministry of Propaganda, the National Socialist regime took active steps in embedding a set of values that it considered as fundamental for the conceptualization of its long-term utopia. Apart from the myth of a rebirth of Germany after years of economic strife and the humiliation of Versailles, the idea that the German nation constituted a community bound by a combination of racial, cultural, and historic factors was of the utmost significance for the pursuit of an ideal fatherland. The discourse of the national community was the cornerstone of the platform for the construction of a new organic notion of German identity. It integrated an array of national socialist ideological beliefs. In the historic and racial superiority of the Germans, or Aryans, in their geographic mission to defend Europe against the hordes of Asiatic invaders, in the brilliance of their cultural output, in their supreme political abilities for leadership, and so on. Thus, the idea of a national community was at the same time a device for disseminating the elitist discourse on National Socialism about pure Germans, and a justification for the purification of the nation from allegedly harmful influences. Every nation needs a leader, the origins of the Hitler cult. A central ideological theme in Nazi propaganda was the special significance awarded to Hitler himself as the utmost incarnation of both National Socialist values and German interest. The impressive and irrational popularity of Hitler himself proved a source of compensation for the criminal notoriety of his generals and party leaders, who were hated by the public. The Hitler cult overpowered individual popular disdain at the thuggish activities of the party mechanism and other institutions or figures that were believed to be out of the direct control of the leader. The propaganda machinery of the Third Reich proved largely successful in establishing an image of the Führer as above and beyond everyday politics. This image was supported by a discourse that underlined the shift from the bureaucratic leadership of Otto von Hindenburg and others to a charismatic mode of legitimization. It rested on the effective cultivation of the idea that the special position of the leader in the National Socialist system originated from his alleged extraordinary qualities, his capacity for incarnating the collective will of the nation and his unqualified dedication to the national cause. In this sense, Hitler came to represent the vision rather than the actuality of Nazi politics, and the promise of spiritual salvation and regeneration rather than its interim shortcomings. The perception of Hitler's relative autonomy from the party and the regime proved extremely convenient for propaganda purpose. What the people forgot was that from the early days of the Nazi Party, Hitler was presented as the savior of Germany by the party members themselves. In the party's ideological view, he was the only leader that was strong enough to rescue the nation from the perceived humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and the threat of communism. Through powerful oratory, meticulously staged rallies, and the overwhelming influence of media controlled by Joseph Goebbels, an image of Hitler as an almost superhuman figure was constructed. He was portrayed as charismatic, decisive, and possessing an uncanny understanding of the German people's desires and destiny. Moreover, he was a martyr because he had endured prison time for fighting for his principles. In truth, he was imprisoned for only 9 months at Landsberg prison, where he enjoyed considerable freedom and comfort, so much that he was able to dictate his book to fellow prisoners Rudolf Hess and Emil Maurice. One of the key concepts behind the success of Hitler as a cultural phenomenon was the so-called leader principle. This doctrine asserted the absolute authority of the Führer at every level of the party and the state. Obedience to Hitler was not just expected, it was framed as a moral imperative, a necessary act of faith in the nation's divinely appointed leader. This principle permeated all aspects of German society, stifling dissent and creating a hierarchical structure where Hitler's word was law. The leader principle implied that Hitler was infallible, so he never made mistakes, and he had the last word in every argument. This was made easier by the relentless propaganda surrounding the figure of Hitler. The emotional appeal of the Hitler cult was immense. In a period of economic hardship and social unrest, Hitler offered a sense of purpose and belonging. His fiery speeches tapped into deep-seated nationalistic sentiments and promised a glorious future for the German people. For many, he became a figure onto whom they could project their hopes and anxieties. The carefully crafted image of a strong, unwavering leader provided a sense of security and direction in a turbulent world. He always appeared impeccably dressed, and his picture was in the cover of every magazine and journal in the Third Reich. He took special care in always showing himself either angry against the enemies of Germany or lovingly celebrating the so-called pure Aryans. Needless to say, not even Hitler, the man whose image is most frequently associated with the Third Reich, was a tall blonde with blue eyes. Rituals and symbols played a significant role in reinforcing the Hitler cult. Mass rallies, like the Nazi Party rallies held in Nuremberg annually from 1933 to 1938, were meticulously planned spectacles designed to evoke a sense of collective fervor and awe. The Nazi salute, the swastika, and party anthems became ubiquitous symbols of allegiance, fostering a sense of unity and shared identity centered around the Führer. These performative acts solidified the emotional bond between Hitler and his followers, blurring the lines between political loyalty and religious worship. The Hitler cult also fostered a climate of fear and intimidation. Dissent was not tolerated, and those who questioned Hitler's authority or the party line faced severe consequences. The omnipresent surveillance of the Gestapo and the SS ensured that outward displays of loyalty were widespread, even if genuine belief varied. This atmosphere of coercion further solidified Hitler's power and made it difficult for opposition to emerge. However, the Hitler cult was not solely based on fear. For millions of Germans, the belief in Hitler was genuine and deeply ingrained. They saw him as the embodiment of German greatness and the key to their nation's resurgence. This fervent belief often blinded them to the regime's atrocities and fueled their willingness to participate in its crimes. The cult of personality created a moral vacuum where loyalty to Hitler superseded traditional ethical considerations. Building a context of blind belief in the leader was one of the main objectives of the Ministry of Propaganda, mainly because it made it easier for common people to adhere to the irrational theories of the Nazis. One of such theories had to do with the origins of the supposedly master race. The Nazi ideologues invented a pseudo-scientific genealogy for the German people. Just as the Italian fascists claimed to be the rightful heirs of the glorious Roman Empire, the Nazis claimed to be the descendants of an obscure people that supposedly migrated from India to Europe in antiquity, the Aryans. Alfred Rosenberg, Occultism, Nationalism, and the Aryan Myth. The Nazi leaders were obsessed by semi-religious beliefs in a race of Aryan godmen, the needful extermination of inferiors, and a wonderful millennial future of German world domination. Racism and elitism also had their place in the nationalistic ideology of the Nazis. The racial differences between peoples from the world was exploited to claim that the German race was superior, but the justifications were incredibly complex and based on several scientific theories from the time and some from the past that were discredited. One of the main influences were the developments of anthropology and linguistics, but these were twisted to fit the racist theories of the Nazis. In their thought, a set of inner moral qualities was related to the external characteristics of racial types. While the Aryans and their successors, the Germans, were blue-eyed, blonde-haired, tall and well-proportioned, they were also noble, honest and courageous. The Darwinist idea of evolution through struggle was also taken up in order to prove that the superior pure races would prevail over the mixed inferior ones. Racial thinking facilitated the rise of anti-Semitism. The question of anti-Semitism was mixed with the conviction that the Jews somehow controlled the economy and were preying on the economic struggle of regular Germans. At the same time, they were blamed for the collapse of traditional values and institutions. Racism indicated that the Jews were not just a religious community, but biologically different from other races. The roots of the Aryan myth are found in the late 19th century nationalist ideology and the so-called pan-German movement in Austria. The advocates of these movements had a vision of a pan-German empire in which the non-German nationalities and the lower classes would be denied all claims to emancipation or representation. Theories of Aryan German racial excellence, anti-liberalism, and anxiety about social and economic changes were among their main concerns, but occultism also played an important part and was their original contribution. Despite the fact that many early Nazis shared a good amount of core beliefs, there is one person who is single-handedly responsible for developing the Aryan myth. His name was Alfred Rosenberg, and his 1930 book, The Myth of the 20th Century, became the seminal work that shaped the beliefs of the Nazis. It was in that book that Rosenberg explained his race theory, where he synthesized various nationalist and racial ideas prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries into a comprehensive, albeit pseudo-scientific worldview. He posited a constant struggle throughout history between the Aryan spirit and the Jewish Semitic spirit, which he blamed for the corruption of Western culture and the ills of modernity. His writings provided a seemingly intellectual justification for the persecution and eventual extermination of Jews, and thanks to this, he became one of Hitler's closest collaborators. In fact, Rosenberg was one of the earliest and most influential mentors to Hitler, introducing him to key anti-Semitic texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. His intellectualized racism provided a more systematic framework for Hitler's own visceral prejudices, helping to solidify the core tenets of Nazi ideology. He served as editor of the Nazi Party newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, which helped him disseminate the Nazi ideas even before Goebbels' ministry was founded. Rosenberg was born in 1893 in what is now Tallinn, Estonia. He studied architecture at the Polytechnical Institute of Riga, finishing his PhD in Moscow in 1917. During the German occupation of Estonia in 1918, Rosenberg served as a teacher of drawing at the Gustav Adolf Gymnasium and the Tallinn Polytechnic School. From an early age, he developed anti-Semite feelings and gave his first speech on Jewish Marxism on the 30th of November, right after the 28th of November 1918 outbreak of the Estonian War of Independence. When the Imperial German army retreated, he took the chance to emigrate to Germany, along with Max Scheubner Richter, whom Rosenberg considered an ideological mentor. Once he arrived in Munich, he started working in the newspaper known as the Völkischer Beobachter, which can be translated as the Nationalist Observer. Here he found a large circle of people that shared his anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism, most of them organized around the figure of Adolf Hitler. Around this time, Rosenberg became one of the earliest members of the German Workers' Party, later renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, joining in January 1919, 8 months before Adolf Hitler joined in September. Rosenberg was also involved in more obscure ideological circles. Allegedly, he was also a member of the infamous Thule Society, an organization dedicated to studying occultism and ancient symbolism. The name of the society comes from a mythical country mentioned in Greek legends. Thule was an imaginary island supposedly found in the farthest north, which made medieval and modern scholars identify it with Scandinavia. According to the members of the Thule Society, the land of Thule was the capital of the ancient Hyperboreans, a people that lived in the snow and that the Thule Society members thought were of strong build, with blue eyes and blonde hair. They were also paganistic and did not follow Christianism nor any church. The Thule Society hypothesized that Thule, or Hyperborea, was the ancestral origin place of what they called the Aryan race, a term that had been used only in linguistics to refer to a hypothetical language used by Indo-European peoples in the remote past. In comparative linguistics, a science that was rapidly developing in the 1920s, Aryan referred to a common grammar and not to people of any particular color or ethnicity. But in the hands of the Thule Society, and especially of those members that were also members of the Nazi Party, it became a synonym of a long-lost master race that needed to be protected against the intrusion of lesser peoples. It was Alfred Rosenberg who first combined these far-fetched theories with those of genetics. He observed that, according to biology, genes are responsible for allowing certain traits to be developed by the individuals. Certain genes, such as the ones who produce blue eyes, are recessive, whereas the ones that produce brown eyes are dominant, meaning that they are more likely to be inherited by future generations. Rosenberg took this as proof that mixing races would eventually lead to the extinction of the blue-eyed people. His theory proposed that when races got mixed, it was always the worst characteristics that got passed into the following generations, thus degenerating the human race in the long run. His solution was to force blue-eyed Aryans to only mate with other Aryans in order to protect the better genes from going extinct. Who were the Aryans? A historical lie that sealed the fate of millions. But who were the Aryans exactly? It seems that nobody explained to Rosenberg at an impressionable age that the word Aryan did not apply to race, but to language. But this didn't deter him from developing a complex and mostly senseless theory that linked ancient Aryans with modern-day Germans and gave the latter a reason to reclaim their rightful place as the foremost race in the world. Rosenberg had been interested in philosophy since he was very young. At first, he studied the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, who was also much admired by Hitler. He also studied Immanuel Kant, the Königsberg professor, who was considered a hero of culture by many North Germans. While still a young man, Rosenberg also began to read Indian philosophy and religious literature. Here he disagreed with Hitler, whose interest in India was always restricted only to understanding how the British managed to maintain their rule over the subcontinent for so long. But Rosenberg read the Vedas and other Indian religious writings, which he thought had been written at the time of the immigration of the Aryans to the north. He naturally admired the caste system, which in his view should be applied to Europe in order to protect Aryan tradition and genetics. In his own words, the ruin of the good blood means the ruin of all. The Aryan theory was prophetic and was mainly based on the writings of earlier 19th century esoteric writers such as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian mystic and writer. In 1888, Madame Blavatsky wrote a book that became the blueprint for the Aryan theory of the Nazis. It was called The Secret Doctrine, and she wrote it while on a trip to Madras, India. supposedly after checking several ancient Indian sources that Rosenberg could only dream of reading. In truth, she plagiarized part of the book and invented the rest, but this did not stop the Nazis from reading it like gospel. The secret doctrine claimed to describe the activities of God from the beginning of one period of universal creation until its end, a cyclical process which continues indefinitely over and over again. This is a common principle of the Indian philosophy, for whom time is cyclical and periodically starts again. Blavatsky's story related how the present universe was born, from where it came, what powers control it, how it progresses, and what it all means. The first volume of the book, called Cosmogenesis, outlined the scheme according to which the primal unity of an unmanifest divine being became differentiated into a multiplicity of consciously evolving beings that gradually filled the universe. This happened at the beginning of time. The divine being created three cosmic phases that became time, space, and matter. Later on, Blavatsky describes the 7 rounds or evolutionary cycles that all creation has to go through according to the divine plan. Each of the phases of the world is characterized by the predominance of a different element: fire, air, earth, water, ether, and so on. Madame Blavatsky's book was illustrated with a variety of esoteric symbols, including triangles, triskelions, and swastikas. It is easy to identify the influence of her work in the imagery of the Third Reich. The swastika was regarded as an ancient Eastern sign of fortune and fertility, and was so important that Blavatsky included it in her design for the seal of the Theosophical Society, an esoteric organization that she founded in Europe. The second volume of his book was called Anthropogenesis, and consequently dealt with the way in which human beings are related to her esoteric vision of the cosmos. The theories of Blavatsky and others were partly derived from late 19th century scholarship concerning paleontology, but adopting a racial theory of human evolution. Blavatsky extended her cyclical doctrine with the assertion that each round witnessed the rise and fall of 7 consecutive root races, which descended on the scale of spiritual development from the first to the fourth, becoming increasingly rooted to the material world, and ascending from the 5th to the 7th through progressively superior root races. According to Blavatsky, present humanity constituted the 5th root race upon a planet that was passing through the 4th cosmic round. So the logical next step was a process of spiritual advance. This was taken by the Nazis as proof that they were the chosen ones that would lead humanity to its glory. The following root race was called by Blavatsky the Aryan race, and had been preceded by the 4th root race of the Atlanteans, which had largely perished in a flood that submerged their mid-Atlantic continent. And while the Atlanteans were giants with psychic powers, the Aryans were simply the superior human beings, characterized by their white bodies, blonde hair, and blue eyes, along with square jawlines and other characteristics associated with Germanic peoples. Based on the work of Blavatsky, then, her successors prophesied the coming of a future era where the German people would rule the world. Their writings described a prehistoric golden age when wise Gnostic priests of Aryan origin had developed a racially pure society of blue-eyed blonde people. Unfortunately, they explained, this superior Aryan society had to endure an evil conspiracy by anti-Aryan peoples like the Jews or even the early church. These inferior races had sought to ruin this ideal Germanic world by emancipating the non-German inferiors in the name of egalitarianism. The resulting racial confusion was said to have heralded the historical world with its wars, economic hardship, political uncertainty, and the frustration of German world power. It was then the duty of the true Germans, the rightful successors of the Aryans, to destroy this modern world and create a new one where they were the rulers. To this effect, the defenders of the Aryan ideal founded secret religious orders dedicated to the revival of the lost esoteric knowledge and racial virtue of the ancient Germans and the corresponding creation of a new pan-German empire. The Thule Society was one of such secret orders, and the one that raised the interest of Alfred Rosenberg and even Adolf Hitler. Applying the racial principles, the Nuremberg racial laws of 1938. How did these ideological and esoteric theories translate to the practical government of the Third Reich? In 1935, director of the Gestapo Reinhard Heydrich published an article titled "Combating the Enemies of the State," claiming that the state was only a means to an end, the end being the protection of the German Aryan people. Thus, the Gestapo was tasked with combating the enemies of the people. In his discourse, the Gestapo thus became doctor to the German national body, keeping watch over its health and compelled to combat all pathogens and diseases ruthlessly. The causes of this disease of the National Socialist national body were quickly ascertained. They were communists, Freemasons, and the churches. And above and behind all these stood the Jews. Under the direction of Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo became the protector of the Nazi ideology and of the Aryan myth. As such, Himmler laid down the two basic principles that would govern the Gestapo from then on: racial selection and blind obedience. These became criteria not only for deciding who was an enemy of the people and who wasn't, but also who could become part of the Gestapo and who was not allowed into its organization. Himmler thought he could select only individuals of pure Nordic blood and teach them military discipline in order to create a superior elite organization to protect the Third Reich from the enemy within. The selection process to enter Gestapo was extremely severe. Candidates were examined and checked. Out of 100 applicants, only an average 10 to 15 passed the checks. They were asked to produce the political dossier of their parents, brothers, and sisters, their genealogical tree back to 1750, and naturally they needed to pass a physical examination and their record in the Hitler Youth movement. Furthermore, they were asked for a dossier on their heredity, proving that their parents and their family suffered from no hereditary diseases. These diseases were considered a symptom of impure blood, as it was believed that pure Aryans could never beget certain illnesses. Himmler even took his system far beyond the secret police with the creation of the Lebensborn, the fountain of life. This twisted institution was a sort of human stud farm where young girls selected for their perfect Aryan traits could, free from all conjugal bonds, procreate with SS and Gestapo men also chosen according to the same criteria. The children born of these unions were fruits of a planned eugenics and belonged to the state, and their education was ensured in special schools. In theory, they were destined to form the first generation of pure Nazis fashioned in the ovum. The collapse of the regime did not allow the Nazis to pursue this experiment any further. Nevertheless, 50,000 children were born in these stud farms. The formulation of the central ideology was one thing, but how did these thoughts make their way into the heads of the Gestapo officers? In this, the National Socialists left nothing to chance. Himmler himself was convinced that his men had to be ideologically instructed. Himmler had a series of training establishments set up, including the Security Police Leadership College in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin, which had until then been known as the Police Institute, and the Border Police College in Pretzsch. The ideological training of the Gestapo officers was valued even more highly after the outbreak of war, since ideological coherence was of the greatest importance in the war of extermination, ensuring the smooth functioning of the security police's task forces. Anti-Semitic indoctrination was, of course, the top priority. The Jews were the public enemy number one. Various training materials were compiled, and the trainers had to be able to ground the theory in practice. For the leadership of the security police, it was not only about conveying knowledge. Rather, examples of this ideological attitude were also to be set. Consequently, a majority of the instructors had themselves played an active part in the so-called final solution to the Jewish problem. Himmler and Heydrich, the ideologues of the Gestapo, believed that equally important to protecting the purity of Aryan blood was fighting the enemies of the German people. These were the gays, the communists, and the Freemasons, but above all it was the Jews who were blamed for everything bad that happened to the German citizens. This is confirmed by the viciousness with which the Gestapo persecuted the Jewish people of Europe. In 1933, 525,000 Jews were living in Germany, with 144,000 of them living in Berlin. By 1939, just 300,000 Jews remained. From 1940 to 1944, 134,000 German Jews were deported to the slave labor and extermination camps in Poland. The total number of German Jews killed in the Holocaust has been estimated at 160,000. German Jews who survived were mostly in mixed marriages or were the children of such unions. Contrary to popular belief, the Gestapo did not particularly persecute Jews during the first 2 years of the Third Reich. It was only after the Nuremberg race laws were passed in 1935 that they were sought after. The Nuremberg laws allowed Jews to be arrested for a new crime, race defilement. It criminalized sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. This made it easier for Jews to be denounced to the Gestapo for breaking the law. It was therefore only after the introduction of the Nuremberg laws that the Gestapo became more heavily involved in Jewish persecution. Many Gestapo offices set up dedicated race defilement sections. In Berlin, the Gestapo often used entrapment techniques. A number of teenage girls and prostitutes were recruited by the Gestapo for the express purpose of luring Jewish men into compromising sexual situations. Elsewhere, the Gestapo mounted prying surveillance operations on couples suspected of being involved in illegal sexual relationships. There were often raids on the homes of couples to catch them in the act of sexual intercourse. Between 1935 and 1940, 1,900 people were convicted of race defilement. The average sentence was 18 months for this offense. Those convicted served sentences in normal prisons or in prisons using hard labor. In March 1936, the Gestapo complained to the Ministry of Justice that sentences passed by judges for this offense were too lenient. Heydrich demanded that sentences of penal servitude be applied more regularly. It was during 1938 that the persecution of Jews escalated most dramatically inside Nazi Germany. A special decree of 26 April 1938 obliged all Jews to record all their wealth in terms of money and goods. In June 1938, police were ordered to rearrest any Jew who had completed a sentence for breaching the Nuremberg laws and transfer them to a concentration camp. By the autumn of 1938, up to 75% of all Jewish businesses had been closed down. In November 1938, the Hitler government organized a nationwide anti-Jewish pogrom. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo at that time, sent a memorandum to local Gestapo offices at 11:55 p.m. on 9 November, reporting the violent actions against Jews that were already being undertaken. Müller told Gestapo officers to stop the looting, but not to impede the setting fire to synagogues or the vandalizing of Jewish shops that was going on. This well-orchestrated night of horror became known as Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass. Anti-Jewish riots were reported throughout Germany. Nazi thugs and SS men set alight synagogues and prayer houses. Irreplaceable objects of huge religious value were tossed onto a funeral pyre of pure anti-Semitic hate. Individual Jews were beaten up, homes and businesses ransacked. Around 91 Jews were murdered, and 30,000 Jews were arrested, allegedly for their own safety. Approximately 10,000 Jews were sent to the three main concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. Nearly all the Jews arrested were released within 6 weeks. In a press release, Joseph Goebbels claimed German actions were understandable. Thanks to the continuous harassment by the Gestapo, no Jew in Germany or any of the conquered territories of the Third Reich was safe. The end of the Aryan blue-eyed myth. Germans face the cruel reality. But every myth has an end, especially one that was so far removed from reality that it was really difficult to sustain. In truth, very few of the members of the Nazi Party and of the higher echelons of the Third Reich fitted the ideal of an Aryan person. This very obvious flaw in the theory did not stop the Nazis from repeating it over and over. The rise of Nazi Germany was predicated on the propagation of the Aryan blue-eyed myth, an ideology that posited the superiority of a master race characterized by specific physical traits and a supposed historical destiny. However, as the years progressed, and particularly as World War II unfolded, German citizens were confronted with a reality that starkly contrasted with this myth. A gradual disillusionment began to develop, a painful awakening to the falsehood of racial supremacy and the devastating consequences of Hitler's leadership. Initially, the Nazi regime's propaganda was highly effective in fostering a sense of national pride and racial superiority. The Nazis, especially through their propaganda institutions such as the Völkischer Beobachter and the Ministry of Propaganda, were effective in constructing an ideal of Aryan beauty that permeated art, culture, and social life, creating a total culture that aimed to unify the German people under a common identity. This was reinforced by propaganda that celebrated military triumphs and expansion, seemingly validating the myth of Aryan prowess. O'Shaughnessy argues that the Nazis functioned as a brand, skillfully packaging their ideology to gain popular support and maintain power. However, the seeds of doubt were sown early. Even within the framework of Nazi ideology, there were inherent contradictions. As mentioned before, most Nazi leaders themselves did not fit the Aryan ideal. Moreover, the regime's policies of racial purity and persecution revealed a darker side, one that contradicted the image of a benevolent and enlightened master race. The turning point, however, came with the war. While early victories reinforced the myth, the prolonged conflict and the increasing hardships began to erode public confidence. From 1941 onwards, Nazi propaganda shifted from celebrating triumph to justifying a defensive struggle, particularly after the harsh defeat at Stalingrad. The war's expansion, including the entry of the United States at the end of that year, stretched Germany's resources and exposed the limitations of its military might. The home front also experienced increasing strain. The impact of the war on daily life was enormous, disrupting social norms and creating anxieties. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns brought the war home in a tangible and devastating way, contradicting the regime's promises of protection and victory. Hitler had promised the German people that the borders of the Third Reich could never be breached, but this was further contradicted since rumors of prominent Nazi leaders fleeing the country began to expand in 1943, further undermining public trust. The eventual defeat of Germany and the revelations of the Holocaust shattered the Aryan myth completely. The atrocities committed in the name of racial purity exposed the moral bankruptcy of the ideology and the horrific consequences of Hitler's leadership. The German people were forced to confront the reality that they had been complicit in a system built on lies and hatred. By the time the Red Army stormed Berlin, the common people's belief in the infallibility of the Führer were at an all-time low. Nobody was thinking whether the invading Russians were inferior or not, especially since many of them were effectively blonde and had blue eyes. The demise of the Aryan blue-eyed myth came at the end of a gradual but inevitable process. While Nazi propaganda initially captivated the German populace, the harsh realities of war, the regime's own contradictions, and the exposure of its crimes led to a profound disillusionment. History teaches how the German people's journey from fervent believers to disillusioned witnesses serves as a powerful lesson about the dangers of unchecked ideology and the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths. Völkisch Fury, the rise of ethnic nationalism in Nazi Germany. The German concept of nation has historically differed from that of other European political traditions. In countries like France, shaped by the ideals of the French Revolution, the nation was understood as a construct based on the collective will of citizens united by a shared identity within a common territory. Similarly, Italian nationalist thinker Mazzini linked the idea of nation to principles of liberty and popular sovereignty, emphasizing the role of historical and cultural legacy as a unifying factor. In the United States, nationalism also emerged from a self-determined and voluntary perspective. In contrast, German nationalism, especially its romantic strand, held that the nation was not chosen or built but inherited. For thinkers such as Herder and Goethe, national belonging was defined by biological and cultural traits passed down through generations: language, customs, and blood. This naturalistic and determinist vision considered being German as an innate condition rather than an acquired one, and established a direct link between racial characteristics and national identity. Over time, this notion became intertwined with racist and anti-Semitic theories, leading to the belief that German identity was fundamentally tied to the so-called Nordic race. The idea of a supposed Germanic Aryan superiority had several pre-modern precedents. One example is Gothicism, upheld in late medieval Spain by the aristocracy to justify their social preeminence, which declined in the modern era with the rise of popular religious and regional racism based on the concept of blood purity. A similar narrative existed in France, where the dominance of the Franks, Germans, over the Gallo-Romans was defended by proponents of the French sword nobility in the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Henri de Boulainvilliers. This idea was later countered during the Revolution by Emmanuel Sieyès, who exalted the struggle of the Gallic people against the oppression of the Frankish nobility. Thus, a Celtic myth and a racial interpretation of history took shape, spreading widely in France and other nations during the first half of the 19th century. The Germanic myth took much deeper root in Germany than in France, as in Germany it served a popular rather than an aristocratic function. Its precedents can be found in the exaltation of the German language during the Middle Ages, where several authors claimed it was the Adamic or pre-Babel language. This idea crystallized between the 15th and 17th centuries, especially with the rediscovery of Tacitus's Germania, which began linking blood to genealogical origin. One of the most influential proponents of this notion was Martin Luther, who argued that the universal empire belonged to the German people rather than the emperor, justifying this by claiming that Germans descended from Ashkenaz, the eldest grandson of Japheth, son of Noah. At that time, even German Catholics maintained that the Ashkenazi Jews were the first settlers of Europe, bringing with them the primordial language and monotheism, from which their superiority over other peoples of the continent supposedly derived. The Enlightenment in the 18th century, with its critical approach to the biblical narrative, prompted a reformulation of the Germanic myth based on new assumptions. The term that quintessentially defines the idea of German nationalism is Volk, people. This word refers to a group of individuals, community of blood, with the same ethnic and racial origin. From this idea emerged two closely associated concepts: Volksgeist, or spirit of the people, national genius, a philosophical concept from German Romanticism that posited the existence of a suprapersonal, unconscious nationalism, as well as the spiritual and material characteristics emanating from it, and Volksgenosse, meaning citizen or member of the community who has biological ancestry within it, and possesses all the anatomical and psychomoral traits attributed to it. This blood-based community is tied to a specific territory, land. The union of the people with the land they inhabit gives rise to the name of the country. Thus, countries are named after the people who live there. Deutschland is the land of the Germans, Russland the territory of the Russians, England that of the Angles English, and so on. The German etymology land shows a strong dependency between the population and the geographic space it occupies. The concept of country is conceived according to Germanic law of medieval, feudal origin, in which land is a fixed and inalienable inheritance of the inhabitant, or rightful owner, and is non-transferable to foreigners.